Escobar used bombs, Cali used receipts, and that is why the cartel they called the Gentlemen of Cali may have been harder to destroy than the monster everyone already knew. Because while Colombia was watching Pablo Escobar turn himself into thunder, Cali was doing something colder. They were buying phone lines, taxi drivers, pharmacies, judges, campaign money. They were building a cartel that did not need to scream because it had learned how to listen. A raid could be planned in secret, and Cali might know before the door was kicked in. A pharmacy could glow like any normal business while dirty money moved behind the counter. A cassette tape could sit quietly in a drawer until one day it cracked open a presidency. That is the real terror of the Cali Cartel. Not that they were less violent, that they understood when not to be loud. And tonight we are not chasing the explosion. We are following the receipt. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Loda, where we explore Latin America's history, mysteries, true crime, and local legends. Always whispering Latin intrigue. Subscribe for fresh revelations every week, perfect for your next campfire debate. Listen first to the quiet, not the explosion, not the siren, not the famous mustache on the wanted poster. Listen to a phone line breathing in the dark of Cali, to a taxi moving too slowly past a hotel, to a pharmacy sign glowing clean and harmless. At the same time, dirty money travels behind the glass. Everyone knows the thunder of Pablo Escobar. But the question tonight is colder than thunder. What happens when a cartel learns that the loudest empire dies first and the silent one can own the room? This is the story of the Cali Cartel, the empire people called the Gentlemen of Cali. At the same time, bodies still fell in the streets, while informants vanished, while politicians smiled too long in photographs. Medellín gave Colombia bombs, public war, and a kingpin who wanted the country to hear his names. Cali gave Colombia ledgers, campaign money, surveillance nets, and violence that wore a suit before it reached for a gun. That is why this story is so dangerous. Evil is easier to recognize when it shouts. Cali preferred to whisper. To understand that whisper, we have to walk into the city itself. Cali sits in southwestern Colombia, in the Valle del Cauca, where the air is heavy with sugarcane, commerce, sweat, music, and memory. This is not a city made only of crime, and it should never be reduced to the men who tried to own it. It is a city of dancers, workers, families, markets, and neighborhoods climbing into the heat. But in the late 20th century, another rhythm began pulsing beneath the salsa. Engines, couriers, cash counters, and footsteps stopping suddenly at the corner. Before cocaine became the monster in the room, Colombia already knew that violence could be hired. In the middle of the 20th century, during the long shadows of partisan bloodshed, landowners, local bosses, and political strongmen used contract killers to defend property, party colors, and old power. Some of those killers were remembered as the birds, men of the countryside and the road, carrying death for elites who rarely dirtied their own hands. The names changed, the weapons changed, the money changed, but the wounds stayed open. That is the part many outsiders miss. The cartels did not invent Colombia's pain out of nothing. They found old cracks and poured gold into them. Poverty in the margins, distrust in institutions, young men without a future, political violence already normalized, and communities forced to survive between fear and silence. When cocaine arrived with its impossible money, the hired killer changed shape. He was no longer only defending a party boss or settling a land dispute. He became a servant of routes, debts, territory, reputation, and revenge. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the drug trade had spread across Colombia like smoke under a door. Medellín was the name that frightened the newspapers, led by Pablo Escobar Gaviria, and men who believed spectacle itself was a weapon. But Cali had its own architects: Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela, Miguel Rodríguez Orejuela, José Santacruz Londoño, and Hélmer Herrera, known in popular memory as Pacho. They were not wandering bandits who tripped into money. They understood business networks, discipline, camouflage, and the power of looking almost legitimate. Their story did not begin with polished shoes and respectable storefronts. Before the cocaine empire, there was kidnapping. One early circle around Cali was known for abductions, ransom, and underworld contacts, the kind of crime that teaches a man who can be pressured, who can be bought, and who can be broken. Then came marijuana, and after marijuana came the white powder with profits so obscene they changed the temperature of whole countries. Cocaine was lighter, more valuable, and easier to hide inside the global appetite, and the men from Cali organized it like a machine. Here is where the chessboard enters the story. Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela was called the chess player, not because he saw the future like a prophet, but because he understood patience. A reckless trafficker thinks about the next shipment. A chess player thinks about the next silence, the next favor, the next judge, the next banker, the next man who can be bought before he becomes dangerous. His brother Miguel was closer to the machinery. The day-to-day pulse, the details that keep an empire breathing, even when everyone pretends not to hear it. José Santacruz Londoño, often called Chepe, moved like a man who understood roads as veins. He helped build international pathways, especially toward the United States market, where New York became a jewel that men killed and lied for. Pacho Herrera carried another kind of weight: connections, enforcement, glamour, fear, and the cold discipline of a man who knew that a cartel's smile only mattered if the weapon behind it was real. Together, they did not need one king standing on a balcony. They built something harder to photograph, a web. Medellín often looked like a pyramid with Escobar near the top, a throne made of terror, loyalty, and spectacle. Cali looked more like a nervous system. One cell could move cocaine, another could manage money, another could store weapons, secure houses, bribe officials, watch phones, count dollars, or punish betrayal. A person might know his manager and his task, but not the whole beast. Cut one thread, and another thread is still held. Arrest one man, and another phone rang. The web was not invincible. Nothing human is. But it was harder to see. Wait, notice this. The Cali Cartel did not hide only in jungle strips or secret runways. It hid in ordinary life. Pharmacies, radio stations, banks, construction, commerce, soccer, advertising. The city saw jobs, buildings, storefronts, sponsorships, and a strange prosperity arriving with no clear explanation. One name became a symbol of this mask: Drogas La Rebaja, the pharmacy chain tied to the Rodríguez Orejuela world. Up close, it looked like medicine and discounts. From above, it became one more place where the line between legal money and poisoned money grew thin. The recurring object in this story is not a golden pistol, it is a receipt. A receipt is humble. It says somebody bought something, somebody paid, somebody recorded the transaction. Now imagine a mountain of receipts, invoices, bank transfers, loans, payrolls, shell companies, radio contracts, pharmacy sales, construction deals, and accounts that learned to speak in a clean voice. The cartel not only moved cocaine, it taught dirty cash to dress itself for dinner. It bought respectability piece by piece until asking where the money came from could feel like an act of war. Some of that money flowed through institutions and businesses whose names became part of historical memory. Banco de Trabajadores, First Inter-Americas Bank in Panama, Grupo Radial Colombiano, and Drogas La Rebaja. The point was not that every clerk, customer, worker, or neighbor understood the machine. That is exactly how the mask works. A normal business has normal people inside it. A criminal empire hides behind their normality. It borrows their uniforms, counters, invoices, and opening hours. It makes the city participate without letting the city fully see what it is carrying. And then there was the phone line. Cali understood information like other men understood bullets. The cartel built ears into the city: taxi drivers, street watchers, people near phone companies, people inside institutions, people paid to notice who arrived, where they slept, which official was moving, which raid was forming. Imagine a foreign drug agent landing in Cali, thinking he is hunting the cartel. At the same time, a driver at the curb has already made a call. Imagine a hotel lobby where the guest book becomes intelligent. The city becomes a listening device. This is why the gentleman's nickname is almost an insult to the dead. It makes them sound civilized, as if a softer voice makes a softer crime. Yes, Cali preferred bribery over bombs when bribery worked. Yes, Cali avoided some of Escobar's open political theater. Yes, its violence was often more selective than Medellín's. But selective does not mean merciful. It means the cruelty was placed carefully, like a knife wrapped in velvet. Silver over lead was not kindness, it was a strategy. And when silver failed, lead was still waiting. The contract killers became visible before many people understood the size of the machine behind them. In Cali newspapers around 1981, a pattern began stalking the headlines: assassins on motorcycles, attacks in the center, sudden deaths carried out with speed and discipline. By January of 1982, the press was naming what the streets already feared. The motorcycle became a warning. 2 men, one driving, one watching. The target steps out after lunch, after work, after a meeting he should not have taken. The engine coughs. The city pretends not to freeze. Then comes the shot, the turn, the escape through traffic. A life ends in seconds, but the message lasts longer. Pay, obey, stay silent. Do not confuse quiet men with harmless men. This was not only a method of murder, it was a language of control. The cartels used it against rivals, debtors, witnesses, suspected informants, officials, and anyone who made the business feel unsafe. And because the killers were often recruited from forgotten neighborhoods, the empire could turn poverty into a weapon, then throw that weapon away when it dulled. In 1981, Colombia saw another dark alliance form after guerrillas from the April 19th movement kidnapped Marta Nieves Ochoa, sister of the Ochoa brothers linked to Medellín. Drug traffickers from rival worlds answered by forming death to kidnappers. The name sounded like revenge, but in Colombia, revenge often grows extra heads. What begins as retaliation becomes a machine for torture, disappearance, and political violence. Medellín and Cali could hate each other and still recognize a shared enemy. In that moment, kidnapping, cartel money, and private violence braided themselves into something colder. On April 30th, 1984, Colombia crossed one of those bridges a country never crosses back from clean. Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, a public enemy of the traffickers, was assassinated. His killing made the state feel naked in front of its own people. The traffickers who feared being sent to the United States began presenting themselves as the extraditables, men whose message was simple and monstrous: better a grave in Colombia than a prison cell in the north. After that, every cartel understood that national policy could be challenged in blood. Escobar's campaign of terror made him the face of evil, and in that shadow, the Cali bosses strengthened themselves. They were not innocent bystanders. They were competitors learning from a rival's mistakes. While Medellín drew the world's gaze, Cali expanded routes, deepened corruption, and built an organization that did not depend on constant theater. The public saw explosions in the distance. The quiet empire counted money in the room behind them, but no shadow lasts forever. The peace between Medellín and Cali was always temporary, more an arrangement than a brotherhood. The cocaine market in the United States had invisible kingdoms, and New York was one of the richest. Cali treated that city like a crown jewel. Medellín's people wanted more. Greed does not respect maps for long. Then, on January 13, 1988, a car bomb exploded at the Monaco building in Medellín, a property tied to Escobar and his family. The cartel war had stopped being a rumor. It became concrete, shaking in the night. Retaliation followed like a curse, answering itself. On February 18, 1988, a branch of Drogas La Rebaja was burned in Medellín, and more attacks followed against properties tied to Cali, including pharmacies and media interests. Up close, a pharmacy is shelves, employees, and mothers buying medicine for children. From above, in the cartel war, it becomes a flag planted in enemy territory. That is one of the ugliest truths of narco power. It turns ordinary places into targets, and ordinary workers into offerings they never agreed to become. Cali's violence was often described as less public than Medellín's, but less public can still rot a city. It can choose the judge, the accountant, the rival, the messenger, the witness, the worker near the wrong storefront, or the boy on the wrong corner. In one notorious attack aimed at Pacho Herrera, gunfire tore through a sports gathering. He survived, but people in the crowd did not. That is the lie of selective violence. It says it has a target, then it teaches the innocent to bleed. And beyond the cartel war, Cali carried another stain. Reported campaigns of so-called social cleansing, violence aimed at people treated as disposable by the powerful and the frightened, homeless people, street children, petty thieves, sex workers, gay men, and others, pushed to the edge of public pity. The phrase "left behind in memory" promised a clean, beautiful Cali. The river remembered otherwise. The Cauca River became, in accusation, an urban memory, a place where some bodies were found after the city tried to wash away what it refused to protect. Let that image sit for a breath. A river that should carry rain, mud, fish, and childhood afternoons instead of carrying evidence of a society deciding that some lives did not count. This was not a mystery. It was human cruelty given organization, money, and permission. And if we tell this part too quickly, we repeat the crime in another form. Because the dead were not symbols only. They were people. People whose names were often not protected by the same society that protected bank accounts, storefronts, and political favors. By the early 1990s, Escobar entered his strange palace prison, the Cathedral. The deal with the government was supposed to contain the monster. Instead, from inside, he continued to command. When the murder of his own associates became impossible to ignore, and when he escaped in 1992, the hunt changed shape. The search bloc wanted him. The Colombian state wanted him. The United States was watching. Cali wanted him gone. Paramilitary enemies wanted revenge. And out of that hunger came a monster built to fight a monster. The people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, remembered as Los Pes, became the name for an illegal force that hunted Escobar's world with money, information, intimidation, and murder. Here, the line between official and unofficial did not disappear in a legal document. It blurred in the smoke. Cali money moved. Some officers opened doors. Intelligence traveled through channels, clean and dirty. The search bloc raided. Illegal hunters burned, threatened, and killed. For 16 months, Colombia watched a war where the enemy of an enemy became a tool. This is where easy stories fail us. Some people want the cartels to be comic book villains with supernatural power. Others want to imagine them as folk heroes beating the system. Both versions are lazy. The truth is more frightening because it is more human. These men were not magic. They were businessmen of poison, using old violence, weak institutions, global demand, poverty, fear, and ambition. They did not defeat the system from the outside. They taught pieces of the system to serve them. That is a harder nightmare to wake from. On December 2nd, 1993, Pablo Escobar was killed on a rooftop in Medellín. The photograph became history almost instantly. The great thunder had stopped. But listen again to the quiet after thunder. Cali knew what came next. For years, Escobar's noise had hidden them in plain sight. Now the gaze turned southwest, toward the gentlemen, toward the phone lines, pharmacies, banks, tapes, drivers, judges, ledgers, and the chessboard. When the loud king fell, the silent empire became the next face of the war. The room behind the room was finally lit. The Cali bosses understood danger. They had money beyond imagination, but money is not peace. They had helped weaken Escobar, but that did not make them friends of the state. They had protected themselves with corruption, but corruption becomes less useful when everyone needs a sacrifice. In 1994, whispers of surrender began to surface. The Rodríguez Orejuela brothers wanted conditions: justice in Colombia, reduced sentences, no extradition if possible, and a way to step away while keeping the fortune the white powder had built. It was a rich man's dream of consequences. But Colombia had already been burned by deals. President Cesar Gaviria's government had watched the Escobar arrangement become a national humiliation. The appetite for another soft landing was thin. The United States, tired of comfortable surrender for men accused of flooding its cities with cocaine, pushed against any ending that looked gentle. Visas were threatened or canceled for relatives of suspected traffickers. The message crossed borders plainly enough. If the gentleman wanted mercy, Washington was not ready to applaud. Cali had mastered silence. But now even silence had foreign eyes on it. Then came the scandal that made Colombia feel the floor move. During the presidential campaign that brought Ernesto Samper to power, money from Cali was accused of entering the race through intermediaries. The figure repeated in the scandal was more than $6 million. According to the story told by investigators and insiders, the expectation was not charity. The cartel wanted protection, negotiation, and softened consequences. Samper denied knowing about drug money, and his personal responsibility became a political battlefield. Colombia's Congress later cleared him personally, but the presidency was wounded, the public trust was poisoned, and the cartel's political bet had become a trap. The cassette became another sacred object in this dark little museum. Small plastic, brown ribbon, a thing you could hold in one hand, carrying the sound of a country's trust cracking. When recordings leaked, rumor became evidence, and evidence became Process 8000, in April of 1995. Voices replayed what money had tried to bury. For years, the cartel understood that secrets move best in whispers, but recorded whispers have their own revenge. They travel after the speaker leaves the room. They refuse to die when the door closes. After that, the order was clear: dismantle Cali. The captures came with the rhythm of doors being kicked open after years of polite knocking. On June 9, 1995, Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela was captured in the Santa Monica residential neighborhood of Cali. The chess player, the man of patience and calculation, was found not in a jungle bunker, but in the city that had been his board. The image matters. A man who built invisibility was dragged back into the visible world where cameras and uniforms could finally name him. On July 4, 1995, José Santacruz Londoño was captured in Bogotá, reportedly after information reached the authorities. Chepe, the man of roots and international networks, learned that every route can reverse itself. On August 6, 1995, Miguel Rodríguez Orejuela was captured in Cali. Still, even that moment carried the flavor of a ghost story. Authorities had once searched for him while he hid in a secret compartment, and a compromised officer helped him slip away. Cali's power was not only in guns, it was on the badge inside the room. Jorge Salcedo, a security man tied to Cali's inner machinery, became one of the strange keys to the cartel's collapse. He had helped build security and communication systems, but the machine began demanding blood too close to him. When the murder of accountant Guillermo Palomari was being prepared, Salcedo faced the old cartel choice: obey and become the blade, or refuse and become the body. He reached out to American contacts and became an informant. In stories like this, betrayal is rarely pure. Sometimes it is conscience, sometimes survival. Often both arrive wearing the same face. Palomari mattered because accountants are dangerous to empires. A gunman can tell you who died. An accountant can tell you how the empire lived. ledgers, payments, names, hidden assets, campaign trails, salaries, routes, safe houses, front companies, the mathematics of corruption. That is where the skeleton keeps its bones. Cali had built itself on paperwork as much as powder, so paperwork became a weapon against it. The receipt returns to the table. It asks the only question dirty money hates: where did you come from? By the end of 1995, the top of Cali had been broken open. Some leaders surrendered, some were captured, some still tried to run through the cracks. José Santacruz escaped from prison and was killed on March 5, 1996, while moving toward another meeting, another calculation, another door that did not open. Pacho Herrera surrendered in September of 1996 in Yombo. In November of 1998, he was murdered inside prison in Palmyra. The myth of gentlemen ended the way cartel myths usually end, not with honor, but with betrayal and fear. Years later, the Rodríguez Orejuela brothers would be extradited to the United States and plead guilty there, agreeing to surrender more than $2 billion in assets. But by then, the old Cali Cartel as a named empire had already entered history, and history has a cruel habit. People look at the captures and think the monster had a head, the head fell, and the body died. But Cali was not built like one head, it was a web. When a web tears, loose threads drift into other corners. Out of those threads came the North Valley Cartel. Rooted in the northern Valle del Cauca, its tone was different, less polished, more openly brutal, shaped by men who did not want surrender, retirement, or quiet wealth. Orlando Henao Montoya became a central figure, remembered as a boss among bosses. When he was killed in 1998, the organization began to crack around ambition. The men beneath him did not inherit peace, they inherited a throne covered in knives. Two names came to symbolize the fracture: Diego Montoya, known as Don Diego, and Wilber Varela, known as Jabón or Soap. Around them formed private armies with names that sound casual and carried the weight of nightmares: the Machos and the Rastrollos. Between 2003 and 2008, as the war for cocaine routes and local power intensified, Cali and the region saw contract killing harden into a market of death. The records point to at least 2,000 killings linked to hired murder during that conflict, with hundreds attributed to the dispute in 2004 alone. This is where the story stops being only about cartel bosses and becomes about a city's daily weather. After the great cartels were dismantled, the gun did not disappear. It became smaller, cheaper, and more available. The old killer served political bosses, then drug lords, and then a new structure appeared: collection offices. The name sounds bureaucratic, like a place with desks and stamps. But many were not offices in the normal sense. They were networks where death could be ordered, debts enforced, revenge purchased, and fear rented by the hour. That transformation is one of the deepest wounds Cali carried into the new century. Once murder becomes a service, it no longer serves only kings. It serves jealous men, local gangs, traffickers, business disputes, personal vengeance, territory fights, and anyone with enough money and enough emptiness inside. The cartel had normalized a logic that outlived the cartel. When institutions cannot be trusted, when justice feels far away, when corruption eats the road, people begin to believe violence is the nearest court. That belief is a poison more durable than cocaine, and the young paid for it. In marginalized neighborhoods, where the city's promises arrived late or never arrived at all, recruiters found boys with hunger in the house and danger already waiting on the corner. A motorcycle, a weapon, a little cash, a name whispered with fear. For a teenager denied dignity, the costume of power can feel like power itself, but it is a trap made of borrowed minutes. The contract killer is disposable too. He is useful until he knows too much, fails once, grows older, or becomes a debt in someone else's ledger. This is why we have to be careful with the glamour. The gold chains, the mansions, the private planes, the nightclubs, the famous names, the streaming shadows glowing on our screens. All of it can look like legend when you do not have to smell the smoke. But under that glow were mothers identifying sons, workers killed near businesses they did not own, neighborhoods divided by invisible borders, children learning which street not to cross, and a city taught to lower its voice. Narco-luxury is always photographed from the balcony. The truth lives under the balcony, sweeping up glass. Cali also teaches a larger lesson about the state. Medellín attacked the state like an enemy army, and everyone could see the assault. Cali entered the state like dampness entering a wall. A bribe here, a favor there, a judge softened, a police contact bought, a campaign funded, a banker useful, a phone worker compromised, a taxi driver listening. By the time the stain becomes visible, the wall has already changed color. That is the genius and the horror of corruption. It does not need to win every battle. It only needs to make honesty feel lonely. The mainstream explanation for Cali's power is not supernatural. The evidence left behind shows a disciplined criminal network that chose corruption, compartmentalization, intelligence, laundering, and selective violence. It built legal-looking fronts, exploited global demand, used United States markets and European routes, and leaned on Mexico and Caribbean corridors when pressure shifted. It was understood that the world's appetite for cocaine did not stop at Colombia's borders. The powder crossed oceans because consumers, smugglers, bankers, officials, and silent neighbors all had their part in the chain, whether they admitted it or not. There are darker popular theories too, the kind whispered whenever a cartel becomes too large for ordinary explanation. Some imagine Cali as the hidden hand behind every decision, every election, every death, every shadow from Bogota to Miami. Those stories are tempting because they make chaos feel designed, but they can also erase the intelligence of local people who understood exactly what was happening around them. The reality is not smaller than a conspiracy. It is bigger. 1,000 ordinary compromises, repeated until extraordinary crime begins to look like normal life. Cali's international reach mattered. Cocaine moved through Panama, Mexico, the Caribbean, and into cities like New York, Miami, and Los Angeles. European routes opened too, tying Colombian suppliers to smugglers and criminal organizations across the Atlantic. When Caribbean routes grew riskier under pressure from the United States, Mexican corridors became more important, and those partnerships helped strengthen criminal organizations in Mexico. Cali did not only move drugs, it helped shape a new map of transnational crime where routes, not flags, became the true borders. But every map hides the human body. When law enforcement estimates placed Cali behind a staggering share of the cocaine entering the United States and Europe, the number sounded almost corporate, like market dominance in a business magazine. Translate it back into life. It means farmers pressured or recruited, pilots bribed, chemists employed, couriers risking prison, neighborhoods flooded, users consumed, officials corrupted, rivals killed, and families on both sides of the border living with consequences they never voted for. A percentage can be a graveyard wearing a tie. The phrase "gentlemen of Cali" survived because it was useful. It allowed journalists, officials, neighbors, and maybe even the bosses themselves to describe a difference between Cali and Medellín. But a polished shoe can step over a body just as easily as a muddy boot. The men of Cali benefited from class performance, from appearing refined, rational, connected to business and society. That mask mattered in a world where respectability opens doors that force cannot. The tragedy is that some doors should never have opened, no matter how clean the hand-knocking appeared to be. And what about the people inside Cali who were not cartel, not police, not politicians, not killers? They lived in the tension between prosperity and dread. Construction rose, commerce moved, jobs appeared, money circulated. At the same time, everyone knew there were questions one did not ask too loudly. That is the moral trap of dirty money in a living city. It pays salaries with one hand and buys silence with the other. It builds a storefront, then makes the neighborhood wonder which wall is load-bearing and which wall is hiding blood. In the early 1990s, Mayor Rodrigo Guerrero faced a city where homicide had become one of the clearest measures of pain. Cali began looking at violence almost like a public health crisis, counting, mapping, trying to understand where the wounds opened and how they spread. A local program promised development, security, and peace, words that sounded almost fragile beside the gunfire, but it mattered. A city cannot heal what it refuses to diagnose. The question was never only who pulled the trigger, it was why the trigger had become so available, so useful, so normal. That is the difference between asking how and asking why. How do the motorcycle, the weapon, the route, and the payment tell us? Why takes us into poverty, masculinity, revenge, corruption, broken trust, old political violence, and the seduction of fast money in places where legal money moves like a tired mule? A policy that counts bodies but cannot hear the stories behind them is always late. Cali's history warns that violence is not only an event, it is an ecosystem, and ecosystems survive by adapting. By the time the old cartel names faded, smaller groups, local drug markets, youth gangs, and invisible borders carried pieces of the inheritance. The mansions could be seized, the bosses extradited, the famous photographs placed in archives, but the streets still had to live with what had been normalized. In some neighborhoods, the corner became a checkpoint, a block became a border, a debt became a death sentence. The cartel era had ended on paper. But paper does not automatically teach a child to feel safe walking home. So the central mystery returns to us. How did Cali become so powerful while standing in Escobar's shadow? The answer is not that Cali was cleaner, smarter in some romantic way, or less violent in any moral sense. The answer is that Cali understood invisibility as a weapon. It dressed crime as commerce. It turned information into armor. It bought the room before the room could accuse it. It made violence look like the last resort while keeping it close enough to breathe. And why was it so hard to destroy? Because destroying a loud man is one kind of war. Destroying a network is another. A loud man has a roof, a voice, a photograph, a pattern. A network has cousins, accountants, drivers, judges, store managers, shell companies, informants, safe houses, corrupted files, and fear moving through friendships. The Cali Cartel could be hit, and it was hit. Its leaders could be captured, and they were. But the deeper logic it fed into the city did not vanish with handcuffs. This story matters for Latin America because it is not only a Colombian story. It is a warning about what happens when inequality, demand, corruption, and spectacle mix with abandonment. It is a warning about how outsiders consume narco stories like entertainment. At the same time, the people who live them carry the grief afterward. It is also a warning against the insult that local societies were fooled by mysterious criminal geniuses. No, people knew, the street remembered. The problem was never ignorance alone. The problem was power, fear, and the price of speaking. The dead were not props in a legend. The street children, the homeless, the workers, the young men recruited from forgotten neighborhoods, the officials who resisted, the families caught between one cartel and another, the people killed to send messages they never wrote. They are the true archive. Their names are not always in the famous books. Their faces do not always make the documentaries. But the land keeps receipts. Every empire leaves documents. Every city leaves ghosts. Cali left both. So when you hear the phrase gentlemen of Cali, do not picture gentlemen. Picture a phone line in the dark. Picture a taxi mirror catching the reflection of a man who does not know he has already been reported. Picture Drogas La Rebaja glowing like any neighborhood pharmacy while the question of money waits behind the counter. Picture a cassette tape turning until a whisper becomes a scandal. Picture a river carrying what the city tried not to see. That is the real face of the silent empire. And maybe that is the most haunting part. Escobar taught the world to fear the explosions. Cali taught us to fear the normal thing beside it, the desk, the bank, the driver, the campaign donation, the friendly officer, the business that arrives too rich too fast. The monster does not always kick down the door. Sometimes it sponsors the door, paints it, hires a guard, and hands you a receipt. Thank you for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.